Hi, I'm David Korn.
And I'm Jim Pinkerton.
And together we're bloggingheads.tv.
That's it.
You know, it's been a long time, which is quite amazing given how much they pay us to do these. You'd think we'd be doing these every day.
And we got a little rusty on getting 6 words right.
well, Bob, right? You get what you pay for. Hours and hours of preparation went into this.
Well, decades and decades, more accurately, because they are, this is the genius of blogging heads. They do get genuinely smart people to do this, at least in my case, and I think yours too, for free. And we are both flattered and cajoled and nagged into doing it, and so here we are.
And it's based on our years of experience.
It is. That's the good news.
Everything there up in the hard drive, just sort of pouring out in random Twitter-like order here.
So David, I know we've all been following the Bin Laden news for the last week plus.
Yes.
But for fun, here's what I did, and let me just get going here, get your reaction to these.
Let me guess. Did you come up with the 10 memes of Bin Laden, per chance? Just a wild guess on my part.
All right. Well, now we're outed as having really done hours of feverish research just to do the presentation here. Yeah, I did. For fun, I did.
Okay, David Letterman, give us your 10 memes of Bin Laden.
These are mostly in order of ascending importance.
Okay. Ascending. Okay, getting more important as we go on.
So most ridiculous to start, and then getting really ominous at the end.
Okay.
Number 1, Bin Laden not dead.
Okay.
The deathers. Okay, not much comment there. All right.
Next.
Right, until we see the long-form death certificate, we're gonna.
Well, we'll leave that to Donald Trump.
Fine, leave that to Donald Trump. All right, number 2, issues of the Bin Laden lifestyle. Sitting there watching TV with a clicker, watching himself, what drugs he was taking.
At the same time, it looked like the plaster was peeling, and this was kind of an ocean nightmare. So, people talked about it being a luxurious compound. It looked kind of in between.
I agree. It was nothing fancy. He could have, if he'd stayed in Saudi Arabia as a playboy, he would have done much better.
If you're not living in a cave, you should do better than this.
Right. Okay. Number 3. This issue's cooled down some. Sort of narrative issues, White House credibility gap. Different versions of the story, human shield, not human shield.
I know people are obsessed with about that early on because that was, it was all interesting what happened, all the details. But I said at the time, which is over a week ago, and I'll say even now, that I thought that the big headline, Bin Laden killed by U.S. raid, would subsume all that stuff. And I think now, a week later, it has. And I don't think anyone's very worried about what the White House said in terms of how much of a firefight there was, whether there was a human shield used or not. I think it is a cautionary tale to my friend Jay Carney and others that, when you get out there with information that's coming in fast in a delicate, sensitive operation, things get garbled, they go wrong, and it was probably unfortunate, but hardly, I think it's a blip.
I agree. Number 4, reflections of all the people, who worked, or at least claimed they worked on the Bin Laden search. We'll get to the SEALs in a second, but just in terms of 10 years of CIA agents and other operatives and so on who've been trying to piece it together.
Well, let me respond with my favorite meme in response, which is, "Hey, government works." We can talk about the SEALs, but to me, what's really engaging here, sort of almost intellectually in terms of looking at institutions, is this 8-year-long effort to nail Bin Laden's whereabouts. I'm not sure all our viewers know, one of my early books was a book on the CIA. I followed a guy who was in the CIA for 30 years, and I found that again and again and again, the CIA really didn't work. It just couldn't do what it wanted to do, whether it was to penetrate East European governments, whether it was to kill Castro in Cuba, whether it was to get good intelligence for the military in Vietnam. Again and again, it just kept screwing up, largely because a lot of the tasks it undertook were very difficult and very hard for any bureaucracy to implement, to achieve, to accomplish. But on this one, you look at everything that's happened, and we do know before 9/11 that the CIA and the FBI had a bead on at least 2 of the hijackers. They had reason to be suspicious of others and completely dropped the ball and failed to make the connections that had a chance of leading to the prevention of 9/11. So, but you start back in 2003, 2004, when they get the first tidbits of intelligence, and their perseverance and setting up a safe house down the street from bin Laden and keeping this quiet. They even briefed members of Congress on this to some degree of, a couple months ago, and word never leaked out. What can you say, Jim? This is, I think, not just the president, but all these folks, and we can, talk about the SEALs specifically, really make us proud of our government servants.
I agree. How about that? Number 5, though, the one that's going to getting more spectacular attention, and is the Navy SEALs. Every Navy SEAL now is getting a book contract or getting a marriage proposal on television. If you saw that, Fox News' own Neil Cavuto asked one of these Navy SEALs, "Look, do you want to date my daughter?" So that's sort of a subset of 4, but nonetheless.
Well, there will be several books coming out. Your colleague Peter Bergen, I think, already has a book contract, and I bet more importantly, there'll be a bunch of movies coming out.
Right? Who could resist?
Who could resist that? We've seen some good books about the hunt for bin Laden. Some good books come out of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. Some involving special forces, some not, and they haven't gotten a lot of attention either in Hollywood or haven't sold that well, because I think a lot of Americans have not wanted to really think that much about either one of these two wars for all the obvious reasons. But, I think we're going to have a lot of literature, a lot of movies, a lot of cultural references. And look, what can you say? The guy who was in charge of the operation, his name is McRaven. I mean, it's like if the Simpsons came up with a special forces guy, they'd call him McRaven. I can see. The McRaven files, and sometimes life imitates your idea of life so well. That, I'm sure when the president was first briefed. By the way, the man in charge of this, his name is McRaven. He said, "In the bag." I'm not going to lose any sleep over this. I'm going to go back to worrying about whether Donald Trump can fire Gary Busey or not.
Let me go back to doing the brackets. All right, numbers 6 and 7. They're somewhat related.
Okay. Double memes.
Pardon?
Double memes.
Double memes are the Obama and the Osama. Scratch that for the record. The Osama bin Laden intelligence file, as they got it in Pakistan. Mm-hmm. And then related to that, the intelligence methods gained from enhanced interrogation techniques, or if you prefer, torture. So the whole.
Well, actually, I don't think those are related. Let's just take one at a time. Okay. I mean, I wrote this piece a couple of days ago that the real prize of this mission was not so much blowing away Osama bin Laden. That does, I think, have some value on a lot of different levels, particularly because we see he had a much more of an elaborate command and control function over Al Qaeda than I think a lot of people had guessed at prior to this. But it's those intelligence files. I talked to one former CIA operative who was actually at the CIA when this operation was going down, and he said even as the helicopter was lifting off, they were downloading information from the cell phones recovered back to Langley in order for them to figure out where people were, who might be possible targets, how to get beads on people right away. So, this is really out of 24. They obviously got a lot of records that it's going to take time to comb through. They have to translate them, and then a lot of them are going to be in code. So you're going to have, code within Arabic. On the hard drives, they may be if they're password protected, it may be such that if you enter the wrong password, they erase themselves. So there are going to be a lot of workarounds. But the most interesting conversation I had with any intelligence person about this was with Wayne White, who used to be a senior intelligence analyst in the 2000s, 1990s at the State Department, in which he said one bonanza out of this is that in looking at the intelligence, not the stuff to exploit immediately in order to blow people up, but you may be able to tell which extremist groups working in Afghanistan and Pakistan, who related or not related to the Taliban, are connected to Al Qaeda and not. As you know, when we think about the Taliban and the people who we and others are fighting in Afghanistan, it's really a tangled mess that the U.S. intelligence is always trying to sort out while the government of Hamid Karzai and the U.S. and the Brits are trying to find parties to have reconciliation talks with in Afghanistan and Pakistan. There could be intelligence in these files that really give these folks who are trying to work towards reconciliation a better idea of who you can talk to and who you can't, more importantly. And so there may be a long tail in terms of some of the positive outcomes or consequences of this intel grab.
Right. Now, given the fact that some of these defectors we've been dealing with are either complete fakes who simply spin a good tale and collect money and go home, or come with suicide bombs and blow up our own agents and so on. So, yeah, it would be useful if we had a better handle on these things. Okay, now I think, since you brought up 24, David, right. Let's talk about torture and whether or not EITs had anything to do with this.
Well, right away we had the people who liked EIT, waterboarding and such, say, see, look what we got. And even had Dick Cheney on your network, Fox News, the other day saying, Obama should be out there waterboarding more. And, looking at what has been, I think, skimpy reporting, because a lot of what's known about the early intelligence nuggets that have come out of this, you have kind of a mixed record between people who are on the inside or were on the inside saying that enhanced interrogation, which sometimes means waterboarding, sometimes means other things like slapping people around or stress positions, produced important crucial nuggets. And you have other people saying it didn't. That there were so many things that came here that you can't isolate any one piece of information. And my pal Mike Isikoff quoted somebody talking about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who gave up apparently one of the pieces of intelligence after he was waterboarded 183 times. But the causality is the issue here. Mike quoted somebody involved in the interrogation process saying he didn't give this up after 183 times he was waterboarded. It was later. It was sometime down the road from that. So, if he didn't give it up at that point, maybe the waterboarding had nothing to do with it. So I don't know. I think right now it's an open question, and maybe even not leaning towards the Cheney side, but whether we get to the bottom of this, I don't know. I don't think we're going to have a congressional investigation that's going to give us the tick-tock on what happened in terms of the intelligence generated for this operation.
Right, and we can say that, as you were sort of suggesting, that this is sort of a Bush 43 versus Obama 44 subtext here.
I mean, there's a lot of people trying to relitigate this fight over with this great outcome. So I remain unconvinced. And but I'm open to the theoretical possibility.
Right. Let the record show this is not the Brennan Center position you're expressing here, in terms of or the ACLU. Number 8. Does the Arab Spring, or what passes for the Arab Spring, from Tunisia to Egypt to Yemen to Syria to Bahrain to wherever else, Iran maybe. Does the liberation, or that's a bad word, liberalization, or even just you want us to say regime change in some of these countries, suggest that if not quite peaceful change, but at least some sort of non-terrorist change in terms involving protests and so on, can obviate the sort of terrorism of Al Qaeda. That there's some middle ground, as it were, between.
But basically, that if you have progress on the ground in some ways, it sort of relieves pressure or resentment or sentiment that might feed or support terrorism. Right. That's the point. What's interesting to me is with the raid and the killing of bin Laden, we don't see people across the Arab world and flowing into the streets, protesting and decrying the United States. There have been some. There were some protests in Pakistan, and now you have the son, one of bin Laden's son, actually the son who always criticized his father and said that he didn't support him, calling for the U.S. to produce bodies and evidence and all this, and raising a fuss about the sort of the due process angle of the raid. But by and large, I think the reaction has been pretty muted, just as we saw again and again in Egypt and in Libya and other places, that these demonstrations against their governments, in Syria too, really seem to have nothing to do with America. I think in Egypt the people wanted Obama and the United States to speak up more forcefully, but we didn't see, burnings of the American flag. There was, American reporters got roughed up by the wrong side, as in the case of Logan and others. But by and large, I think it's partly because of the Obama presidency. I think it's partly because of what's happening in the Arab Spring is really, indigenous. And if you look at it, I think people, are saying, oh, the U.S. got bin Laden. We got other things to worry about. We're more focused on our progress here. So it's all kind of, at the moment, things can turn quickly. Seem to be a positive development globally. What do you think?
Well, I agree with that. Noah Feldman wrote a book 8 or 9 years ago, right after 9/11, saying that, look, every Arab Muslim country is going to have to go through some sort of Islamic revolution, and the revolutionaries do seem to be spearheaded by Islamic. I don't want to characterize them, just say Islamic activists, fundamentalists, whatever you,
right.
Salafists. There's so many words which I barely understand and are hard to really satisfactorily apply to people you never met. But the heart and soul of this sort of Arab nation, if you will, this nascent national religious movement is going to be Islamic, and you're going to have to go through that process.
In part because that was also, it was a very easy organizing principle in terms of opposition. You have, people motivated because of religion. You had religious structures, whether even when they're banned, like the Muslim Brotherhood. That's what happened in Iran with the revolution against the Shah. So
right. That's what happened in Eastern Europe in the 80s with the Christian churches there.
Yeah.
Right. It's the only place, even if you're not preaching anything other than just sort of solidarity, it's the only place where you can even do that much in some of these totalitarian societies. And so we could be in Egypt, for example. It appears that the regime that's going to emerge is going to be, more anti-Israel, at least technically more anti-American. And I would imagine more popular with the Egyptian people, except, of course, the Copts, the Christians there, who apparently are now going to suffer more riots, but they were suffering riots under Mubarak as well.
Well, it's interesting, too, because, during the Bush years, the mantra was democracy is good for stability, in the long run. And sometimes you get hung up on that principle, because then you say, well, what are you doing with the Saudi monarchy? What are you doing with Hosni Mubarak? Because actually democracy often is less stable than autocrats or dictators. You can't do business with just one person. Parties come and go, presidents come and go, and they have to be responsive to the public, which can have changing sentiments. But that was the argument, part of the argument for why we had to go into Iraq, that it would create this wave of democracy. But even as the president Bush once said, democracy is messy. He'd rather be a dictator. It's a lot easier. So we're going to these are the sort of the cross tensions in our foreign policy between American idealism and American realism. And we fight this out again and again and again on different fronts. What do you do with China? What do you do with the Sudan? What do you do with Rwanda? What do you do with Libya? And we see now, I think in the past few months, the consequences, or at least the playing field for this debate that we have, has gotten a lot wider.
Right. We had Mubarak good and paid for, and now look where he is. He's doing us no good whatsoever after having paid him, all these billions over the years. And so,
but you can argue that you got, he was an enforcer of the Camp David Accords for a couple of decades, and that was worth some of the money you paid him.
Right. Now you could argue that, and meanwhile you're going to see new things like another Gaza flotilla.
Yeah.
Apparently leaving from Turkey sometime in June, on almost the anniversary of the last one.
Well, the whole it is in part because of what's happening in Egypt, but aside from that, we can give our Blogging Heads TV viewers a little preview here. That I think the whole issue of Israel is going to again move to center stage, because in the think it's September, the General Assembly of the UN is due to vote on recognizing Palestine as a nation. And Israel, of course, doesn't want that. The U.S. is not, administration is not going to be happy, but it can't block it. This is not a Security Council resolution. This is a General Assembly resolution, and there may be just a handful of countries, one or two, that vote against it, including Israel and maybe the United States. And I think this is going to end up being a pretty big deal, both here domestically and internationally, and will become a big challenge for President Obama, who is due, I think, to see Netanyahu in a couple of weeks, who is supposed to give a speech maybe sooner than that here in Washington to Congress. So the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been subsumed a bit by some of the optimism of the Arab Spring, is going to come right back really soon.
Right. You and I, David, are old enough to remember the incident in 1975.
Oh, speak for yourself.
Or I am.
I was sitting in the basement listening to Lou Reed when this was happening, probably.
I was a freshman in college, being a nerd, sitting in the student union reading the newspapers, and very much remember the Zionism and racism vote in November of '75, which turned Patrick Moynihan from a well-known sort of public intellectual into a national figure with his impassioned speech against the Zionism and racism resolution, culminating in him walking out of the UN General Assembly. And a year later, he was a U.S. Senator from New York, where he served for 4 terms. It will be interesting how the UN ambassador, who currently, of course, Susan Rice, and no reason to think she won't be there, how she will handle this somewhat similar situation. I mean, we can argue about, which is more inflammatory, calling Zionism racism or declaring an independent state from within your own territory or within your own ambit of control, I guess you have to say. I think this will be a major challenge. Both the flotilla, the rerun of the flotilla, which will now occur in this different Arab world where Egypt, for example, which was, at least in terms of its formal politics, kind of quiescent, as the Israelis intercepted all those Turkish ships with various NGOs.
Well, now Egypt has the right and ability to sort of tear down its wall with the Gaza Strip, and which would in some ways justify the Israelis keeping their wall tighter. So I think there are going to be a lot of interesting bounces in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right, including how they now handle Hamas and Fatah. They've actually made some.
Okay, but let's go back to your memes.
Because
I'm just have so much suspense here waiting for the top. We had top two.
Next
what number are we up to?
Number 9.
Okay, okay, I'll give you the drum roll for number 1.
It's Pakistan.
Is what?
Pakistan. Or, as the president says, Pakistan.
Yeah. Or the Pak in AFPAC. Boy, I tell you, how would you like to be the Prime Minister of Pakistan now? It's what do you say? What do you say? Oh, whoops, didn't know about that, or those are just those wacky boys at the ISI. You don't have to worry about them, unless of course they have nuclear weapons.
Right. It would appear that half of Pakistan is pro-American and pro-Western and likes to drink scotch and come to London or New York and shop.
Half?
And the other, who knows? A percentage. And then the other percentage, maybe it's a good deal larger. Who knows? Although I do think that the other chunk is actively rooting for the Al Qaeda and wanting to hurt the United States and so on. I do think that if I were a middle class Pakistani, I would be a lot more interested in seeing McDonald's open up in Pakistan than the next Al Qaeda franchise. But I
caution. There's been there've been decades, hundreds of years of history about what goes on in that region with Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan, and tribes and clans and regions that. We look at Pakistan and Afghanistan through a very, very, very narrow perspective. Basically Al Qaeda and the war against extremists, and now our military presence in Afghanistan. Most Pakistanis, I assume, really don't care about what we care about. They don't care about Al Qaeda. They don't care. They may care about Afghanistan. They certainly care about India. And they are just really, our reality is just really quite different. And so I don't presume to know what their priorities are, but I do think that, whoever's leading Pakistan has a incredibly difficult juggling act and probably doesn't have full, obviously, not probably, but obviously doesn't have full control of the government and the security apparatus. And, that's a pretty frightening thought given, the weapons that they do have.
Right. I agree. All right, well, then on to number 10. Oh, you have some news. You have
this is the drum roll.
Oh, I see the drum roll.
That was the drum roll. That was the veritable traditional drum roll.
Okay, yeah. Number 10, 10th and finally, Afghanistan. A war that is now consuming ongoingly $120 billion a year, a few hundred
longer than any war we've had, right? Longer than
any war we've had. And plenty of people are saying, well, gee, we went to Afghanistan to get bin Laden, and so what are we doing now? Could this be mission creep, to borrow a phrase?
Well, to me, the big question is that Obama set a July 2011 deadline for the beginning of a withdrawal, which would lead to pretty much a total handover and security forces to Afghanistan in 2014. And the debate within the government and the military is going to be, and you can't see me do this because we don't have technology, but I'm making a glide path with my finger, okay? But the problem is I'm looking at myself as I do it, so it's really hard. But whether the path is a steeper decline, you have to imagine this in your mind's eye, or a more level decline. And this, at the very least, an event like this, I think, ups the political pressure for a steeper, glide path in terms of withdrawing troops. I doubt it's going to, change, the military or the administration's perspective. I think they, they stick to whatever strategy they think they have. I don't think it's going to change anything in terms of the efficiencies or corruptions of the Afghan government and military. And I wonder if it will free some of those, some of the political forces here in Washington. As you know, liberal Democrats who don't like the war, I think, have been a little hampered in terms of challenging it too harshly. And now, you're hearing a few more voices on the right. Haley Barbour, who isn't running for president, but when he had people thinking he might run for president, talked about Afghanistan being kind of a waste. And more recently, you have people, not that I care too much what they think about in terms of strategic foreign policy, but people like Ann Coulter and Grover Norquist, appearing, I think, at New American Foundation events, Jim, right next door to you, where you're sitting now, and taking an oppositional view to the Afghanistan war. So there may be more fervent, more of a fervent, movement around as with bin Laden gone. What do you think?
I would agree, and I would also add, of course, Ron Paul, who is probably not going to ever be president, but is a major figure in Republican politics and has a fervent following. If you saw the debate last week in Greenville, South Carolina, the Republican debate, every time he opened his mouth, they were cheering for him. I mean, not the entire audience, but his group. He's always has been a staunch opponent of the Iraq War, just as the Afghanistan War, just as he was for the Iraq War. And you remember 4 years ago, they barely let him debate.
And and then Giuliani just sort of whipped him up the head for raising questions about the wars.
Well, and then now Giuliani's gone and Paul's still running, and he's still a member of Congress. So, if I were Obama, I would be looking to get out.
I know. I think he is, and I think he's serious about some sort of transition. I think, given what we know about him, I mean, the raid is interesting because the caricature of Obama is that he's wrings his hands, he's indecisive often, and he's not willing to take political risks. Imagine what would have happened had this raid not succeeded. He'd be Jimmy Carter, and we'd be showing the old tapes that you and I are old enough to remember of the aftermath of Desert One, the failed rescue attempt to get the hostages held in Iran back in 1980. That gave him the aura of being a loser. Jimmy Carter, that is. So I think he was smart enough, Obama, to realize that if this failed, even though it wouldn't be, for reasons that would have nothing to do with him, a misplaced bullet, a misplaced assumption about something, that he'd be in a deep, deep hole, politically speaking, from now until Election Day. But so I think it was somewhat of a gutsy call, but at the same time, I do think his MO, Obama's, is to come up with the best plan that he can think of to get to the desired outcome he wants. And he has a lot of discipline about sticking to that plan and not sort of relitigating and redebating it over and over again. Now, sometimes our strengths end up becoming our weaknesses. But so that's why I'd be very surprised that there's going to be any real shift. But he has a plan for not ending, but decreasing our involvement in Afghanistan. I think he is going to try to stick to it. Now, we'll see what happens, whether the military resists, whether Congress, forces his hand faster or actually pushes back. People like John McCain and Lindsey Graham, the Republican Party, don't want to see these withdrawals begin in July 2011. So there will be a lot of different cross currents for the Commander-in-Chief to deal with in the months ahead.
Right, and clearly the military has a mind of its own. I mean, it's sort of hilarious to read in the Washington Post every day, the military telling the Iraqi Prime Minister, Maliki, look, you have one more chance to agree to keep U.S. troops there forever. We'll give you one more chance. We'll give you one more chance, And, I mean, it's if the cliche that, that we want military bases around the world while the Chinese want, factories and mines and farms, which is to say productive economic assets, while we go for the right to rent other people's properties, we have a base, seems to be being vindicated as the military plots its policy in both Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unfortunate. I think there's probably something in military DNA as well, that when you have ground, you don't want to give it up, even if even on a contingency basis. And, that's one reason why, people like you, me, and Ron Paul and others often are, want there to be a high threshold for there to be military involvement overseas because of that natural tendency to stay, look at Korea.
Germany.
I mean, I do think that if Donald Trump had not been a cartoon character, he could have made a very serious point. Why are we paying to defend, Korea? When we have a lot of priorities here that we can't afford, and Korea has, become an industrial power on many fronts. And I mean, those are real good debates and conversations to have. But you don't do it by calling people motherfuckers and making bad jokes about it. By the way, as we're talking, I think the news today is that Donald Trump has fallen in the polls from 28?
He was first. He's now first. He went from first to fifth.
To 8 points. He's now trailing. I think in the latest poll, he's trailing Shiny Object by 30 points.
All right, we'll come back to we've mentioned Ron Paul and Donald Trump. We'll come back to the Republicans in a moment. David, is there any other item of interest possible that could be mentioned about
some of the Bin Laden raid? I mean, your memes really cover the waterfront to mix the metaphors. Let me just quickly mention a story that I had this week, which is unrelated to Bin Laden but related to Al Qaeda, which at least I found interesting. I don't know if anybody else did, but in looking, I was tipped off actually by a blogger. Remember those WikiLeaks documents came out in the New York Times and NPR a couple weeks ago, the Gitmo detainee assessments. Well, in one of those assessments, there was a mention not about the person who was the subject of the assessment, the Gitmo detainee, but it had a reference to somebody else, a Pakistani businessman who knew this detainee, who owned several drugstores in New York City, and he was called in this report a possible Al-Qaeda anthrax operative. And the report listed, his name had been found in somebody's diary, his name had come up in some piece of a document that had been found in an Al-Qaeda safe house. It listed a few pieces of intelligence without going into detail and without giving you, the reader, very much of a chance to evaluate how strong this intelligence was. Now, this was shown to me, and it pointed out to me, and I said, this is a hell of a story. Imagine if an Al-Qaeda operative really owns 4 drugstores in New York City. They were basically in Brooklyn and Manhattan. What damage could he do? Could he help, others, Al-Qaeda operatives who are working with biological chemical agents by giving them Cipro and other drugs that make it easier for them to produce biological weapons? You can use a lot of different things. I quickly ran to the internets, and this report was, I think, 3 years old, and discovered that the fellow still owns these drugstores. And I started calling the drugstores, trying to talk to him. And he, I spoke to someone who identified himself as his brother. I spoke to someone who worked at one of his drugstores, and I was told that several years ago he moved back to Pakistan. And I said, well, do you have a phone number for him? No. Do you have an email for him? No. Well, but they all offered to take a message from me and convey it to him. And I was wondering, how are they going to do this? By carrier pigeon? And then, Dan Shulman, who works in my office, did some more digging, and we actually found a phone number for him, and we called it, and we got a woman who said she was his wife, and that he'd never been contacted by U.S. authorities, as far as she knew, if she's telling the truth, and that if we called back the next day, after 10 p.m. their time, he'd be home, and we could talk to him. Well, of course, we called back, and they didn't pick up the phone, and we tried again for like almost a whole week. And every time we called, the phone was never answered. And this happened a few days before, and then a few days after the Osama bin Laden raid. And it left me with sort of a little bit of a journalistic quandary, which is whether to name the guy or not. I mean, it's a public record sitting out there on the internet now. It used to be classified, and it seemed to me that this is rather serious. It could be a serious matter, but perhaps he was also mistakenly implicated. I called the FBI in Washington and in New York, and they said, we don't comment on any leaked documents. So ultimately, I wrote a piece, and we'll put it up. We'll put the link up next to our blogging heads here, and people can read it for themselves without naming the guy. But it seems to me that the FBI, presumably, looked into this, could have said to me, we've looked into this, we've checked it out, there's nothing there, or could have asked me not to run with the story if it was an active investigation, could have given some indication. This happens all the time. And that the matter of the public knowing that this matter was attended to is probably more important than the FBI preserving its policy of we don't comment on leaked documents. So right now it still is, hangs out there as a mystery to me, but a mystery with, I think, some very frightening possibilities attached to it.
Wow, that's quite a story.
And people can argue, whether I should have, run it or not. I've gotten, opinions on both sides. But when something hits those tubes, and it's out there in public, and anyone can read it, it sort of changes one's calculations.
It's also interesting. I mean, just a few points. One, the fact that these kind of documents are being crowdsourced. I mean, your friend, the blogger, obviously put some time into going over these.
Exactly.
And meanwhile, the fact is that anybody could pick up your trail if they wanted to, I mean, when you say, look, these documents are publicly available, I mean, the WikiLeaks, I forget my ignorance, they're posted somewhere.
These are all up there. There's a database now, a couple, I think, being maintained of these, detainee assessments. So other reporters can, can pursue it further if they want to, or anybody, any citizen can find the stuff and decide, for him or herself whether they're going to, promote and publicize the name of this person.
Yeah, and I'm not, without saying anything about whether that's, I think it's probably better to be restrained than not, just in terms of, not wrecking this guy's life if he's innocent. But anyway, I mean, any time there's a spectacular event, you read it later that the police had a clue to this and didn't follow up on it, or lost the file, or the guy was hung over and never did anything, and so on. And then there's a kind of fog of life applied to a lot of these situations. You always find out.
Well, I was just waiting for a next door neighbor of Osama bin Laden's to come out and in front of the TV camera say, I didn't really know the guy next door. He was such a quiet man.
And the gunshot sounded like firecrackers. Don't forget that part. Or car backfires.
But before we finish, because I don't know you, but I got to get some real work done today. We talked about a few presidential candidates. Newt Gingrich is, apparently announced on Monday of this week. He announced that he would be announcing on Twitter and Facebook, thus showing he doesn't understand the medium. I'm going to leak to Politico that I am announcing on Twitter. It's like, okay, as they would say in Twitterland, fail. But I
think they do @fail.
Well, it's actually hashtag fail.
Hashtag fail. Right.
So, do you have any? I've written so much on Newt over the years. I just want to laugh this off. But do you have anything to say about this presidential contender?
This particular one?
This particular one.
Newt?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's a smart and interesting guy who, actually, interestingly enough, that same poll that showed Donald Trump went from first to fifth from 27%, I think it was, to 8%, I noticed showed Newt third.
Right.
I think it was Huckabee 19, Romney 18, and if I remember, it was a PPP poll. It's a Democratic polling firm that has a great track record. I'm only saying the Democratic part to help identify them, the Googlers out there. Anyway, 19, 18, 13. The really strong candidates of 6 months ago were Palin and then Trump, and now they've both gone down and do not rule out Gingrich. I can remember reading Karl Marx's essay, The 18th Brumaire of Louis-Napoleon, where he described Louis Napoleon was the grandson of Napoleon Bonaparte, and took over as leader of France in, I think, 1851, 30 years after Napoleon had died, in a completely different political context. And the point that Marx made was that the Royalists had a royal candidate, and the Radical Republicans had a Radical Republican candidate, an anti-monarchist candidate. And Louis Napoleon was sort of somewhere in between. And the next thing you knew, he was president of France and then emperor of France.
So you're saying Newt's going to become emperor?
He might become president. Look, it's...
he is such a loose cannon. I think he's also becoming, put aside his messy, personal life and his, bogus explanation. I worked so hard. I love America so much. That's why I cheated, which was just, still, I think, after Donald Trump is probably the second best political joke of the year. He has this 33-year history of popping off, mouthing off, saying all sorts of stuff that he should never say, and he doesn't have the discipline to be a presidential candidate. I don't know. I don't see him connecting with people. I don't see people thinking that he is one of them, or that he represents them. He comes across as kind of an arrogant know-it-all who goes for the cheap shot. Remember, he said that the way we can best understand Barack Obama is that he has the worldview of a Kenyan anti-colonialist. I don't know how many of them ended up killing Osama bin Laden or the equivalent back in those days. So I remember he's a trash talker. I know he has some good ideas. I know he likes to think of himself as an ideas man, but at least 50% of his life has been devoted to the most thuggish and often inaccurate rhetoric, and I don't think that's going to wear well on the presidential campaign.
Well, on the other hand, he gave a very thoughtful speech to the Brookings Institution a couple of weeks ago, in which he talked about medicine and how echoed a lot of the arguments I've been making.
Well, no, I'm not saying. Listen, he does that, but then the next day after that, he'll come up with something completely out of his tuchus, and that as you know, on the campaign trail, those things tend to get more attention than those thoughtful speeches.
You're right. I guess my thought is, I know we don't need to go on too long about this. Is the Republicans are going to nominate somebody? It's a mathematical certainty that somebody. Right, and I think that it's quite likely, and we spent 45 minutes chatting, interestingly, at least I hope, and I think about the Middle East and foreign policy and so on. But the average American is suffering from high gas prices and underemployment. I think even in Mother Jones I saw a big article about McJobs.
Well, the Mick recovery. I mean,
the Mick recovery, and there's a guy named Mish Smedlock.
Mish Smedlock.
Mish, M-I-S-H.
It sounds like a Mel Brooks character, but go ahead.
Or a Russian secret agent, who wrote a very interesting piece taking the unemployment. We'll put up the link. Putting the unemployment data in perspective and saying that if there's U1, unemployment 1, unemployment 2, unemployment, like money supply, there's different numbers, different versions of these data runs. And he said his calculation is that U5, as the government calls it, as the Labor Department calls it, is up around 11 or 12%. Yeah. And the Gallup has underemployment at around 20. The people that you and I, David, have both criticized relentlessly over the last 4 years, and we shouldn't miss a chance to do it now, the kind of Hank Paulson to Tim Geithner continuum of Baylor outers and sort of plutocrat protectors are still in charge, and they're still shaping American policy. And from our different perspectives, David, you and I would agree that what they're doing is pretty much coming at the expense of the average American. And I think the average American has kind of figured it out. And so it's interesting that, I think the bin Laden raid was one of the best pieces of policy, daring do, effectiveness, good news for America, revenge, whatever you want to call it. I just fully in his admiration of it as, Joe Biden is. And yet, it doesn't seem to have pushed President Obama up much above the mid-50s. I mean, compared to Bush 41 going to 90, or Bush 43 going to 90, or John Kennedy going to, I think, the high 80s after the Cuban Missile Crisis, if I have that right.
Really? After the...
maybe it was the Bay of Pigs. Maybe it was the Bay of Pigs. It was actually kind of a failure.
Yeah, the Bay of Pigs.
But Kennedy, a total failure, to be blunt about it. I think Kennedy made a speech, said, look,
this is why I think a lot of Republicans are so frustrated, because with unemployment being as high as it is, and underemployment being as high as it is, and our economic prospects, not being very shiny at the moment, that there is a great opportunity for a Republican to challenge the incumbent Democrat, and yet you don't really see anybody, rising, to the task, and at least in any, dramatic, cinematic, conclusive way. Now, there will be a Republican nominee. This is like if you imagine, say, March Madness. What do they start with now? 68 teams. It used to be 64 teams. There's a mathematical certainty that one of those teams, no matter how bad they could pick the worst 64 teams in the country, but one of those teams in a tournament is going to win 6-7 games in a row straight. Has to happen.
Right.
So someone has to get nominated, and that person will have these negative wins at their back, and they'll have a great opening. The public will be looking to them and saying, okay, what are your ideas? Here we're in economic doldrums. Even when we get unemployment to into the low 8s or even below 8, people are still going to be underemployed. The jobs being created are not going to be as good as a lot of the jobs that were lost. So there's this wonderful opportunity, and right now I don't hear too many Republicans speaking to it. And on the Hill, you hear people just talking about cutting Medicare, which whether you agree with that or not, Jim, that's not really going to create jobs, at this, anytime in the near future. It's not, that's almost a separate problem. So, I don't know. I mean, I just don't think Newt is a person who's going to fill that opening.
Well, maybe not, but and again, I don't want to stretch things out too much, but I actually think the Medicare issue is an interesting example. I think the Ryan plan was misconceived, too much, too soon. as I wrote in a five-part series. Seriously, it was like 9,000 words total. The American people wouldn't object to deep cuts in Medicare if they were based on transformational technology.
Yeah.
We don't mind the fact that we're paying 99% less.
You and I have talked about this. We agree on this?
We have.
This is where we put the care back into health care.
This is where we put the cure back into healthcare. This is where we decided beating is cheaper than treating.
Yeah.
This is the missing sauce in the thinking of both parties, which have reduced healthcare to nothing but finance and sort of retrospective paying for disease. And as I wrote in this series, I said, look, there's actually a weird kind of similarity between the Obama policy and the Ryan policy. They're both based on the idea that the consumer of the payer of healthcare can limit care by sort of judicious management. In Obama's case, it's IPAB, the Independent Payment Advisory Board, saying we're going to pay less, or the government, or the bureaucrats, or CMS, or the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Or in the Ryan plan, it's the notional, educated, empowered consumer. Your mother, my mother, deciding what the best health care for her is at an advanced age.
Yeah.
I really don't think that's a realistic model of how people, especially when they're elderly, consume health care.
Oh, not at all. I mean, that's why I don't understand why the so-called adult in the room, Paul Ryan. The premise of this is that market forces and more or less consumers, as you put it, Jim, putting market forces to smart and effective use when they're in there, not to denigrate old people, but when you're in your 70s, 80s, or 90s, and you're facing, very serious issues, and you may have money at your disposal, you may not, and that somehow is going to lead to better care. Well, anyway, we should do another thing.
Well, let me make one point, then I'll let you wrap up. One person who warned that the Ryan plan was on the wrong track was the same Newt Gingrich.
Okay, here's my vote. I'll be standing with him at that Twitter press conference on Wednesday. In fact, I will retweet him, okay?
Well, listen, your vote is a secret ballot. I could never, get in the way of that.
My tweet isn't.
But your tweet is not. That's right. Listen, folks, come Wednesday, if I'm going to be looking for the what is it, hashtag David Corn.
David Corn, I will tweet often and tweet early.
All right, there we go. Now we're making progress. This is how Louis-Napoleon did it. One vote at a time.
One vote at a time. Okay, well, Jim, as great. It's been too long, but it was fun.
It was fun.
As always. And next time we'll try to generate a little more disagreement for the people out there in bloggingheads.tv land.
It's a deal, but our audience likes thoughtful conversation. At least that's our line, and we're sticking to it.
Okay, see you next time.
Thanks, all. All right, bye-bye.